Hello, I'm Jenna Lopez, Research and Knowledge Mobilization Specialist at the Learning Network at the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children at Western University. On behalf of the Learning Network and the Knowledge Hub, welcome to today's webinar entitled Workplace Harassment and Violence Against 2SLGBTQIA+ Populations, Microaggressions as a Form of Gender-Based Violence. I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are learning, speaking, and hosting this webinar on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenapehoak, and Chinogton nations. These lands are connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. Today, this land continues to be home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. We give our deep respect to the first inhabitants of this land and recognize that an acknowledgement of Indigenous land and sovereignty comes with a responsibility to understand the history and ongoing impacts of settler colonialism. These impacts continue to be felt in disproportionate and everyday ways against Indigenous communities. We also reflect on those who came to this land involuntarily, particularly those brought to these lands because of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. As the Learning Network is focused on mobilizing knowledge to end the spectrum of gender-based violence, we also recognize that today, these nations face disproportionate forms of gender-based violence and a crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and 2SLGBTQIA+ peoples. We recognize the responsibility for our work to be informed of the colonial imprint and harms that shape the experiences of GBV among Indigenous communities. We commit to furthering our work in ways that best uphold solidarity with Indigenous survivors and those supporting them. We are pleased to be joined today by Christine Wildman. Christine Wildman is a queer critical feminist, activist, and academic dedicated to 2SLGBTQIA+ community organizing. They co-founded Workshop, Building Safer Spaces, a nonprofit providing education and consultation services to organizations seeking to be more inclusive to 2SLGBTQIA+ populations. Christine holds a PhD in sociology, specializing in identities and social inclusion, with research and teaching focused on 2SLGBTQIA+ rights, intimate partner violence, and service access in small to medium population centers. They are also a research and knowledge mobilization specialist for Neighbors, Friends, and Families, a provincial IPV prevention campaign at the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children. I will now pass it over to Christine Wildman to start the webinar.
Thank you, Jenna. I want to start by saying I'm joining today from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the Neutral Nations. And I'm here to talk about harassment and violence against 2SLGBTQIA+ populations at work, and particularly microaggressions as a form of gender-based violence. I'm a queer, gender non-conforming white settler, and I've primarily worked within the gender-based violence sector. So what does being two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, asexual, plus have to do with work? 2SLGBTQIA+ individuals face significant barriers in the workplace, including hiring discrimination, microaggressions, and wage disparities. Workplaces are more than just physical spaces. They are communities where we spend much of our time. We build relationships and we seek a sense of belonging. It's common to hear people say that they have no issue with 2SLGBTQIA+ identities, so long as they aren't discussed at work or made too visible, arguing that politics should be kept out of the workplace. However, this explanation really isn't typically applied when heterosexual colleagues talk about their partners or their families. Like many 2SLGBTQIA plus individuals, I've often been labeled as too political simply for existing as my authentic self. But being a member of the 2SLGBTQIA plus community isn't a political stance. It's actually just an intrinsic part of who I am. Sexuality and gender diversity shape our experiences. It influences how we are perceived, and it impacts the opportunities that are available to us. So the objectives of this presentation are to help us understand how microaggressions contribute to us LGBTQIA plus individuals' experiences of gender-based violence at work. We'll look at the historical framing of IPV and GBV in Canada and briefly examine the legal frameworks addressing harassment and violence at work. I will define microaggressions as a form of gender-based violence experienced by 2S LGBTQIA plus workers and discuss their impact. We will explore research findings on 2S LGBTQIA plus experiences at work and identify strategies to build relationships and create safer and more inclusive work environments. I want to begin by examining how intimate partner and gender-based violence have historically been framed in Canada. My perspective is shaped by my identity as a queer and gender nonconforming person, and many years of working in the sector, as well as my research and sociological lens, which informs my understanding of structural violence within the IPV and GBV sector. Structural violence against 2S LGBTQIA plus people is not just a social issue, it's a form of gender-based violence, and it's also a form of, it's also embedded deeply within the gender-based violence sector itself. The dominance of a rigid gender binary continues to shape how gender and sexuality or sexually diverse people are included, treated, and recognized in this space. In the 1970s and 80s, feminist activists played a crucial role in bringing attention to domestic violence, but their framing of it as a binary issue depicting the helpless, battered woman and the controlling, abusive man deeply influenced public perceptions and response strategies. And while this approach provided really essential support for many survivors, it also excluded those who did not fit the colonial cisgender heterosexual archetype. So lesbians were often viewed with suspicion, and trans people even more so, based on the assumption that if they did not conform to rigid gender roles associated with victimhood, then they must instead align with a perpetrator role. This binary framework continues to shape research, funding, legislation, and service delivery. The gender-based violence sector remains largely structured around a cisgender heteronormative victim-perpetrator model, reinforcing systematic exclusion. As a result, 2S LGBTQIA plus individuals face significant barriers to accessing support, being represented in policy, and even being recognized as survivors, but also as service providers. While public understandings of IPV and GBV are slowly evolving, they remain rooted in cis-sexist, heteronormative, and binary assumptions, impacting not only service delivery, but also hiring practices and workplace inclusion. So within the GBV sector, 2S LGBTQIA plus individuals often encounter barriers to employment, a lack of representation in leadership roles, and workplace cultures that fail to fully acknowledge or validate their identities and experiences. These systematic exclusions not only affect staff well-being, but also limit the sector's ability to provide truly inclusive and effective support for all survivors. So while systematic exclusion continues, we do have workplace protections under the law. Provinces and territories in Canada have occupational health and safety acts aimed at keeping us safe at work. And not all occupational health and safety acts in Canadian provinces and territories specifically mention gender-based violence, but most include provisions on workplace violence, harassment, psychological safety, which encompasses GBV, including homophobic and transphobic comments and microaggressions. So Ontario's OHSA's definition of workplace harassment and violence is engaging in a course of vexatious comment or conduct against a worker that is known or ought reasonably to be known as unwelcome, including sexual harassment. This also includes harassment and violence, including microaggressions against 2SLGBTQIA plus individuals. In terms of federal legislation, it was changed in 2021 for federally regulated workplaces to include harassment and violence as occupational health and safety issues and to make employers legally obligated to act. The primary aims of the changes to legislation were early intervention, timely and effective responses, and support for affected people. The federal government's definition of harassment and violence is any action, conduct, or comment, including of a sexual nature, that can be reasonably expected to cause offense, humiliation, or other physical or psychological injury or illness to an employee, including any prescribed action, conduct, or comment. This means that homophobia and transphobia and other forms of 2SLGBTQIA plus discrimination are considered harassment and violence at work. Employers must ensure that workplace policies, reporting mechanisms, and protections explicitly address and prevent homophobic and transphobic behavior, creating a safer and more inclusive environment for all employees. So in 2022, the International Labor Organization released a guide titled Inclusion of Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender, Intersex, and Queer Persons in the World of Work, which highlights the widespread discrimination, exclusion, violence, and harassment faced by these communities across various sectors. And then in 2020 and 2021, the federal government conducted a 2SLGBTQI plus action plan survey, which is sort of the largest one that has happened in Canada, so it's pretty exciting. And 25,636 2SLGBTQI people living in Canada responded, sharing their experiences, including with employment. And so results showed that 37% of respondents felt that sharing information about their sexual orientation would reduce their chances of being hired in a non-2S LGBTQIA plus workplace. In relation to gender identity, 43% felt that sharing information would reduce their chances of being hired in a non-2S LGBTQIA plus establishment. 47% of respondents felt that sharing information would reduce their chances of being hired for Two-Spirit folks, and transgender women were the most likely to believe that sharing information about their gender identity would reduce their chances of being hired. The 2SLGBTQI Action Plan survey also looked at workplace comfort, and 46% of employed respondents felt comfortable sharing information about their sexual orientation at work, which means that more than half did not feel comfortable. Asexual and bisexual respondents were less comfortable compared to other groups. 47% of white respondents felt comfortable compared to 35% of South Asian and East Asian respondents. 30% of Black respondents were comfortable compared with, or were not comfortable, sorry, compared with 12% of white respondents. And so this highlights the ways that holding intersecting identities can influence one's experiences and feelings of comfort, suggesting that individuals with intersecting marginalized identities face unique challenges that compound, leading to heightened discomfort and feelings of exclusion and alienation. In terms of gender identity, 59% of respondents were comfortable sharing information about their gender identity, and gender diverse and non-binary respondents were less comfortable. And when individuals feel uncomfortable sharing details about their identity, it indicates a workplace where they do not feel safe, and don't have a sense of belonging or feel like they are valued in that space. In the 2SLGBTQI action plan survey, 26% of respondents experienced harassment at work due to their sexual orientation. Two-spirit and queer respondents were the most likely to experience harassment. 36% of respondents from racialized other groups experienced harassment, followed by Indigenous and Black respondents. And just a side note, racialized other groups is a category that the federal government used to combine three separate survey populations: Asian other, Black other, and racialized person other, to ensure enough responses for reporting. Those with disabilities are also more likely to experience harassment than those without, and 22% of respondents experienced harassment at work due to their gender identity. 47% of trans men and 45% of trans women experienced harassment at work. 32% of respondents from racialized other groups experienced harassment based on their gender identity, followed by Black, Indigenous, white, and racialized respondents. Common forms of harassment based on sexual orientation or gender identity included microaggressions, verbal slurs, and sexual harassment. Common reasons for not reporting included fear of not being taken seriously, fear of reprisal, and addressing the issues informally. So constantly dealing with microaggressions can lead to psychological stress through increased stress, anxiety, and depression. Feeling undervalued or discriminated against can lead to lower job satisfaction and cause a lack of motivation. The emotional toll of dealing with discrimination can decrease a worker's productivity and engagement at work. And workers who experience frequent microaggressions or feel unsupported may choose to leave their jobs, which then leads to higher turnover rates. All of this was found in the action plan survey. I want to focus in on microaggressions because they are the most experienced type of harm in the workplace, with 92% of respondents in the 2SLGBTQI action plan survey reporting experiencing them. Microaggressions are subtle and often unintentional actions or comments that reinforce stereotypes and perpetuate discrimination against marginalized groups. Our interactions at work are shaped by societal norms, which often reinforce exclusionary practices. If we think back to the historical framing of IPV and GBV, and the dominant narrative being the helpless, battered woman versus the controlling, abusive man, this framing excluded 2SLGBTQIA plus populations, reinforcing the idea that we don't experience IPV or GBV and that we aren't needed in the sector. As a result, 2SLGBTQIA plus individuals have been systematically excluded from both service access and the work itself. Research shows that when 2SLGBTQIA plus individuals seek intimate partner and gender-based violence services, we often face further gender-based violence. The same pattern happens in the workplace where exclusion and marginalization are reinforced because workplaces often reflect broader societal biases. And this isn't only about service access, it's about who gets hired, who feels safe at work, and who stays in these roles. Microaggressions are a subtle yet harmful form of harassment. They create hostile, exclusionary work environments, causing 2S LGBTQIA plus workers to feel uncomfortable and unseen. The impacts of repeated microaggressions include emotional distress, lower job satisfaction, decreased productivity, and higher turnover rates. And the root causes of exclusion and microaggressions are cisnormativity, which is the assumption that being cisgender is the norm. And being cisgender means identifying as the gender that you were assigned at birth. And so this would be denying the existence of and excluding trans and non-binary and gender diverse people. And heteronormativity, which is the assumption that heterosexuality is the default, marginalizing diverse sexual orientations. This manifests in workplaces through language like assuming pronouns and gendered greetings, representation or lack thereof in leadership, staff, and policies, expectations around gender roles and workplace norms, and in policies and institutional practices in terms of who gets hired, promoted, or protected in the workplace. It also often shows up in ways that are performative, for example, by having inclusive policies, but not doing the work it takes to be inclusive. Cisnormative and heterosexist climates reinforce systematic exclusion of 2SLGBTQIA plus workers. And if left unaddressed, this leads to unsafe and inequitable work environments. And so addressing microaggressions is not just about individual behavior, it's about systematic change in workplace culture, policies, and leadership. And in the gender-based violence sector, it's also about shifting to more inclusive understandings of violence and as well as terminology and practice. In the context of gender and sexuality, microaggressions can take many forms, and research has shown that there are often 7 variations of universally experienced 2S LGBTQIA plus microaggressions. And those include offensive heterosexist language, support of only heteronormative and cisnormative behavior, assumptions of a singular 2S LGBTQIA plus experience, exoticization, disapproval of 2S LGBTQIA plus experiences, denial of societal heterosexism and cissexism, as well as speculation of sexual or gender pathology or abnormality. So the idea that people are not who are not heterosexual or do not identify as the gender they were assigned at birth are not normal or are somehow mentally ill or in need of fixing. And we like to think that that doesn't still exist, but it very much does. So common to SLGBTQIA plus microaggressions at work include assumptions about gender identity rather than asking how someone identifies, invalidating or dismissing someone's identity, dismissing experiences of discrimination, with comments like that doesn't happen here or you're being too sensitive, claiming everyone's a little gay or labels don't matter, which invalidates lived experiences, leaving 2S LGBTQIA plus topics out of diversity and inclusion initiatives, or leaving out intersecting identities that often compound harmful experiences. Not including gender neutral restrooms or policies that support trans and non-binary employees, stereotyping or tokenizing 2SLGBTQIA plus employees or coworkers, expecting them to provide the needed education, inappropriate curiosity or comments about a coworker's transition or relationships, making jokes about being gay, bisexual, or trans, for example, that's so gay, or making comments about bisexual people being like fence sitters, or comments like I identify as a walrus or helicopter, or things like that are quite common at the moment. As well as making comments like, it's okay, you can just use that washroom, we are all safe here, which invalidates a trans or non-binary's or queer person's experiences with washrooms, right? That washrooms are a place where a lot of harm is experienced by anyone who is identifying outside of binary gender norms. Asking questions like who's the man in your relationship is also quite common, as well as misgendering without correction. So this is something that happens frequently, and it's really important to note that we all make mistakes. I've misgendered people many times, even my own children. It takes practice. And the best way to handle a situation like this is to correct yourself and move on, not making a big deal about it, which would then make it about you, but simply correcting yourself and moving on. I also want to note that not all microaggressions are verbal, and nonverbal microaggressions are equally as harmful. So some examples include exclusionary body language, like non-verbally signaling someone is not welcome, facial expressions of disapproval, or invasive staring, judgment, or discomfort with someone's appearance, their gender expression, their relation, or their relationships. Ignoring or dismissing contributions from 2SLGBTQIA plus staff, purposefully, or maybe even not purposefully, stepping back from or recoiling when when a 2SLGBTQIA plus person enters your space. Silent resistance is very common through projecting an unwillingness to try to be inclusive or to use inclusive language. Not representing 2SLGBTQIA plus populations in workplace and community-facing materials or spaces is also common. And although these types of microaggressions are nonverbal, 2SLGBTQIA plus individuals can still perceive and feel their impact. If you've ever been in a space where you felt merely tolerated rather than accepted, then you've experienced that feeling firsthand and can imagine what it might be like to experience that feeling throughout much of your time at work. Um, so an activity when I'm in person that I often do is microaggression Jenga, but we're going to imagine it instead. So imagine microaggressions as a game of Jenga. Not every block you remove represents a microaggression, and not every microaggression causes the tower to collapse. But over time, as more blocks are taken away, the structure becomes weaker and more unstable. Each microaggression, whether intentional or not, adds to the strain, making it harder to stay balanced. Eventually, the weight of these repeated experiences can cause everything to come crashing down. It's not just about experiences within a person's current workplace, because trauma accumulates over time. And so when I conduct trainings, I often use the analogy of a trauma backpack where everywhere I go, I carry the weight of Canada's long history of structural violence against 2SLGBTQIA plus populations, and of my own past experiences, negative encounters with employers, coworkers, doctors, service providers, family members, and even strangers on the street, all shaped by how my identity has been perceived and treated. I might enter a new space and be greeted by someone who seems friendly, but they might make an assumption about my identity. And if I correct them, maybe they take a subtle step back. And this may not intend to cause harm, but in that moment, my trauma backpack opens up and all those past experiences come rushing to the surface. That one small microaggression may not affect me one day, but on another, it could send me spiraling. The point is that 2S LGBTQIA plus people carry the accumulated weight of identity-based trauma. And these experiences are often reinforced in spaces that operate within heteronormative and cisnormative frameworks, which are most spaces, to be honest. A single interaction isn't just about that moment. It can be about everything that happened before that as well, right? For me, this reality has never felt more real than it does right now because 2S LGBTQIA plus communities have been under attack for the last few years. In the past year alone, I've been called homophobic and transphobic slurs or a pedophile and a groomer more times than I care to count, simply because of my identity. Sometimes it happens at protest, but other times it happens in everyday moments, at the grocery store, walking down the street, or even on my way to teach a class. Like many other 2S LGBTQIA plus individuals, my trauma isn't buried deep. It's right at the surface right now. Each new encounter isn't just an isolated incident, it's a reminder of the constant hostility we face, reinforcing the weight of those past experiences. Within the sector, we talk a lot about the importance of trauma-informed practice. And from a trauma-informed perspective, including 2S LGBTQIA plus experiences in conversations and work related to IPV and GBV enhances rather than diminishes our understandings of them. We can recognize that violence is deeply gendered, with cisgender men being the primary perpetrators. We can also recognize that men can experience violence. However, women, 2S LGBTQIA+, including trans and non-binary individuals, face the highest risks. Intersectionality also matters, as those with intersecting identities, such as Indigenous, racialized, and disabled individuals, experience the highest risks, and especially when it comes to extreme forms of violence. And so by broadening our understanding, we can ensure more inclusive and effective services and workplaces within the sector. So those of us working in the IPV and GBV sector have most likely have a lot of training around trauma-informed practices when supporting clients. But what if we applied these same principles in our relationships with our coworkers as well? A lot of the times when we do training for work, we think about it from a client perspective. And much of the trainings that we take at work can apply in our everyday lives to our coworkers, to our family, to our friends, and how we engage with community. 2S LGBTQIA plus trauma-informed practice is an approach that recognizes the unique experiences of trauma within 2S LGBTQIA plus communities. It involves creating safe, affirming, and inclusive spaces by understanding the impacts of systematic oppression, discrimination, and violence. It's important to recognize that 2S LGBTQIA plus individuals face additional barriers at work, including misgendering, denial of experiences, and assumptions about relationships. And I'm going to add a little piece in here about my own experiences with working in the gender-based violence sector. So I am queer, I'm gender nonconforming, and I work in the gender-based violence sector, and I've done so for many years. For a long time, a part of what I had to do to fit within the sector was identify in much more feminine, like as much more feminine than I feel. And so in order to continue the work and get hired in the field, I really did have to pretend, sort of play a role as someone that I wasn't necessarily, right? And I've now reached the point where I'm not doing that anymore, and I'm going to identify as me. But it has been a really long journey for me to get to this place, and part of it speaks to the fact that the field, the gender-based violence sector, has opened up to some degree, but there are still many challenges. And so a part of addressing those challenges is acknowledging that IPV and GBV services have historically excluded 2S LGBTQIA plus survivors and workers due to binary cis heteronormative understandings of violence. We must also address the historical mistrust of queer and trans communities towards IPV and gender-based violence organizations, and the need for the intentional rebuilding of trust. It's also important to work alongside 2S LGBTQIA plus individuals in ways that are affirming rather than tokenizing or performative. A 2S LGBTQIA plus trauma-informed approach integrates cultural awareness, intersectionality, and centers 2S LGBTQIA plus voices, ensuring that policies, practices, and workplace cultures are responsive to diverse identities and lived experiences, not just on paper, but in practice. I think most of our organizations at this point have really wonderful policies, but we need to focus a lot more on how we put those policies in practice. So strengthening principles of trauma-informed 2S LGBTQIA plus allyship at work involves ensuring that 2S LGBTQIA plus employees feel emotionally, psychologically, and physically safe at work. This includes inclusive policies, clear reporting mechanisms for discrimination and harassment, including microaggressions, and leadership accountability. And so what that means is also staff and whoever the designated recipient of harm, whether it's HR or someone else in your organization, should understand microaggressions as harassment, and be able to recognize those, because most often what queer and trans people hear when they do come forward and make a complaint about microaggressions they're experiencing is, oh, that was nothing. It was just a mistake, or it was just a off the cuff comment, and it's not really meant to be harmful. It doesn't matter if it was meant to be harmful, right? The intent is not what's important in this moment. It's how do we handle this situation and validate a person's experiences rather than diminishing them. Trust and transparency is about fostering open communication, confidentiality, and equitable workplace policies, ensuring anti-discrimination policies are consistently enforced and maintain transparency in promotions, pay structures, and HR processes for 2S LGBTQIA plus staff. I also want to note it's important to name the populations you are hoping to protect in these policies, because often they're left very broad and open to interpretation, and it's better to actually name the populations you're aiming to protect. It's also important to respect the autonomy of 2S LGBTQIA plus employees by supporting their leadership, decision-making, and ability to express their identities, if they choose to do so, openly without fear of retaliation at work. So that when I say if they choose to do so, this also means protecting their identity if they don't want to be open about their identity at work. In terms of cultural awareness, we can emphasize and commit to continuous learning. And so this could be, broad range equity and diversity training, but it also needs to include nuanced training that provides an understanding of 2SLGBTQIA plus history in Canada and the structural violence that our populations have and in some ways continue to experience from our major institutions. And so we also want to be having education around addressing workplace biases on all fronts, amplifying 2SLGBTQIA plus voices in decision-making processes, as well as other marginalized groups. And it includes ongoing training, including those in leadership roles to attend training, and on creating inclusive spaces, inclusive management, and prioritizing diversity in hiring and retention. We also want to recognize that 2S LGBTQIA plus workers experience compounded discrimination based on race, disability, class, immigration status, and other social locations. And so we need to be addressing this through workplace equity initiatives, mentorship programs, and structural inclusion strategies. We can practice active allyship by encouraging all employees or coworkers, and especially allies, to speak up against discrimination, microaggressions, and harmful stereotypes. And this includes intervening when we witness inappropriate behavior, amplifying 2S LGBTQIA plus voices, and advocating for inclusive policies and practices. And so when I think about all of the places I've ever worked in the gender-based violence sector, have really worked hard to ensure that they've had policies that are truly inclusive. And that part of the work is probably the least, right? Like it's a lot, it's easy to write that out. It's a lot harder to put that into practice. And we are currently in a political climate where we're seeing people feel more able and open to express their homophobia and transphobia, including in the workplace. And so the sense that I have currently from folks that I'm talking to who are working in various sectors is that things are going to get worse. And so I think we had a pretty good 10-year run prior to the last 3 years, and then things have shifted. And generally, there's a lot less acceptance. And so we want to sort of move into a gender-based violence sector that is accepting and that can help to provide the public education needed around 2S LGBTQIA plus inclusion. Okay, so key takeaways. Historically, the IPV and GBV frameworks have excluded 2S LGBTQIA plus populations, both in service provision and in employment opportunities within the sector. While legal protections exist at both the federal and provincial level, systematic inequities in the labor market persist for 2S LGBTQIA plus individuals. And microaggressions in the workplace are a form of gender-based violence impacting mental health, job satisfaction, and employee retention. And so one of the things I want to note is that it's really important to remember that the same structural barriers that 2S LGBTQIA plus individuals face in society are also present in the workplace. And so one of the things that I think is really important is we're often told that, okay, if these things are happening, you need to come forward and talk about them, which I think is very, very important. But I think it's also, from a trauma-informed perspective, important to note that 2S LGBTQIA plus people often don't come forward because they have historical trauma of coming forward and their experiences being invalidated. And so we have these protections under the law, and we have policies in our workplaces that are protective, and we have human rights codes that are protective measures. And um, I, for one, have had many experiences in my life that would warrant a human rights complaint, and I've never actually followed through with it, despite the fact that I have a degree in human rights and I know that process very well. And the reason I've never followed through with it is because there is so much harm that happens that at the end of the day, people are often exhausted. They don't want to fight the system further or anymore. And so what we can do in our workplaces as bosses and colleagues and managers and coworkers is try to create the environment where these things aren't happening in the first place. Um, so we can apply trauma-informed skills to rebuild trust and increase meaningful 2SLGBTQIA plus allyship by actively engaging or actively challenging and addressing microaggressions, discrimination, and violence at work. And so I'm not an advocate of like big major call outs. I think I would never be advocating for people to be like centering people out. But I think there are moments where you have an opportunity to pull somebody aside and say, that that didn't sound good. Like what were you meaning by that? And just checking in and seeing, because sometimes they might not be meaning anything and might not be aware of the behavior they're doing. Um, but if you help them notice it, they can work to change it. Um, so one of the things that I think is important too is that the research shows that positive workplace experiences are shaped by inclusive leadership, dedicated allies, and 2S LGBTQIA plus specific policies and programs, implementing meaningful and not just implemented in meaningful ways and not just written on paper. Developing policies and guiding principles is only the first step and often the easiest one. The real challenge lies in turning them into tangible, lasting change. It's also important to recognize that 2S LGBTQIA plus communities are not passively enduring violence and harassment. We are resilient. And this is a bit of a tough term for me because resilience is a bit of a double-edged sword, right? We are living in a society where we've always existed and we shouldn't have to be resilient, but we are. And while this sort of resilience framework highlights our strengths, it can often also be harmful when it's used to normalize adversity, shifting the responsibility onto us to endure rather than addressing the systems that perpetuate harm in the first place. And so by breaking down barriers, addressing anti-2S LGBTQIA plus harassment and violence, including microaggressions at work, and intentionally fostering relationships and building partnerships with 2S LGBTQIA plus individuals and organizations through trauma-informed practice and allyship, we can create an IPV and GBV sector that is not only safer, but also more inclusive and equitable for all, so service users as well as people working in the field. And so I think I've been sort of doing education around these topics for well over a decade, probably nearly 15 years. And some of the challenges that I've come up against have been like the argument that or the belief that if we talk about gender-based violence in a broader way, then we lose track of the fact that violence is gendered. And as I noted earlier, we are still able to do that work. It just creates a little bit more of an explanation. And in my own research, I talked to many people who experience violence and in terms of their service access. And what I know is that they don't access services because they don't see themselves represented in them. And so I really want to highlight the importance of representation, not just in employees, but also in your materials and in your spaces. Like that is a big takeaway for me. I've trained many organizations over the years, and I've definitely noticed when LGBTQ inclusion has become less of a priority. So for example, initially when organizations do training, they often they put up visual representations of queer and trans identities. And that's really amazing in terms of helping people feel like our populations are thought about at least. And then I've gone back a few years later and all of those materials are gone. And so that becomes challenging because we've done the work, but um, what made that less of a priority all of a sudden? And queer and trans people notice if we are represented in a space, we notice it. I will never enter a space and not notice if there's a flag that represents my populations. And it doesn't tell me that that space is safe, but it tells me that we're at least thought about, and that's really important. Okay, I think that is all that I have. Yes.
Thank you so much, Christine. Thanks for your important and very informative presentation. It's been great. And questions have been coming in from participants. So we'd love to move right into the Q&A. And my colleague Sabri will be joining me to share questions with you.
Yes, thank you, Jenna. So the first question that we received in the audience is about what are the steps that needs to be taken when there is discriminations, and what strategies what are the strategies that we can use to navigate and address discriminations in the workplaces. But let me ask the question. What is the first step an employee should take when they feel uncomfortable or experience discrimination in the workplace? And if you can also comment on what strategy can be used to navigate and address.
Yeah. So if you are someone who feels unsafe in your workplace and you are LGBTQIA+, I think it's really important to find somebody that feels safe to you to talk to first, because that person may not be the HR person or your boss, or like find someone who is an ally. And if that person doesn't exist in your workplace, talk to a friend in the community before you bring forward a complaint, especially if you're feeling like your work may not be supportive. And the reason I say this is because in my research as in 2017, people were still experiencing getting fired from their jobs for being queer or trans. And so if you feel like it's a space that you can't, then don't yet, and talk to someone in the community, or a friend or a trusted colleague. And especially if you have a trusted colleague in your workplace, that person can help to mitigate things, right? Like they can ask you, what should I do to address this if I witness it, right? And then maybe you have an ally who can support. If you do have a boss who is supportive, I think approaching them in a way that doesn't minimize your own experiences, because we often do that, but that expresses that you're experiencing this harm, this discrimination, and even though, like, even saying things like, if it might sound small, but it's an accumulation of small things over time that is presenting in a much bigger way for me. And being honest about it, but also going in with the knowledge that microaggressions are harassment and that workplace harassment is not okay.
Thank you, Christian.
Thank you. I'll share another question. One audience member shared that biphobia and biphobic comments in the workplace are common, but sometimes feel forgotten. And that part of biphobia is the constant erasure of bisexuality and the unique issues faced by bi plus individuals. Can you comment on the unique ways that microaggressions against bisexual individuals might show up in the workplace?
Yes, so a lot of folks who are bisexual hear things like, you just don't know what you want, you're confused, you're a fence sitter, you're you're playing both fields, and they're bisexual folks are also at a greater risk, right? Because they're experiencing harm from heterosexual community and often queer communities. And so they're the challenge becomes that, like, who do they connect with? Who are they experiencing allyship from? Um, yeah, and I think that when we think more broadly about like bisexual experiences in terms of gender-based violence, they're also at higher risk of experiencing, you know, really negative behavior from partners because everyone is seen as a threat. So close friendships from with either male men or women becomes a threat. Yeah, I think it's very, very challenging. And I think a lot of like a lot of the folks at work who are heterosexual will not understand what it's like to be bisexual or what it even means to be bisexual. But that same thing happens from queer community members as well, or coworkers, where yeah, they're just not accepted in either field, which is horrible.
Thank you, Christine.
Yes. Yes, I'll go with another question. Another audience member shared that in their role, they are often presenting to our community on the dynamic of GBV. They try to be inclusive of a variety of experiences of gender-based violence by discussing intersectionality and the ways that different forms of identity privilege played out in power and control dynamic. Do you have any additional recommendations for how to best include the experiences of 2LGBTQA plus folks in a presentation like this, for example?
Yeah, so I think it becomes when we're doing trainings around like equity and diversity, it becomes very difficult because it's such a big topic, right? Um, and I think I'm a big advocate of individualized trainings. I think we can have a broad-based, very basic training about inclusion and diversity. But I think if we really wanted to get at the nuances of like transphobia or homophobia or racism, we have to have more specific trainings around those topics so that we can actually really dive into them. And so for me, from an LGBTQ perspective, this is so it's really important to understand the historical context within Canada, like in terms of we have to go all the way back to colonization to understand gender and sexuality as we know them today. And then we're looking at, the forcing of very specific roles, and then what our systems and our institutions have done to try to force those roles. And so we can't really understand any population from a trauma-informed lens if we don't dive back deeper into the history to see where that harm is coming from, because there's a lot of like generational like violence that has happened.
Thank you.
We received a couple of questions from audience members about how education can be done within a workplace without the 2SLGBTQIA plus staff being the ones doing it.
Yeah.
One person asked if this could be considered a microaggression, if the same individuals in a workplace are sort of tapped for doing presentations focused on 2SLGBTQIA plus issues. And someone else asked, when there are many persons who are part of the community, they may not just be as visibly part of the community as others, and may not be tapped to do these kinds of things.
Yeah. So yes, it is harmful to ask the staff who are LGBTQIA plus to to do the education that is needed, because those are often the folks who are experiencing the harm, which is the reason the training needs to happen in the first place. So yes, it definitely is harmful. And you're right, it also does leave out people who don't necessarily get coded as being within the 2SLGBTQIA plus community. So this is my area. This is what I do. I'm a researcher, and I've created and facilitated trainings for many years. And so I often get asked to do these kinds of trainings, even in my own workplaces, which I've been okay with, but it really is harmful to have the folks that are experiencing harm to be the ones facilitating. I'm a big advocate of bringing in outside sources for training, because it takes the pressure off the people experiencing the harm for having to provide the education. And that little bit of removal from the organization, I think, allows for all of the people involved, like everyone in the workplace, to hear the information in a different way. And so I'm also a big advocate for paying for training. Like in situations where you're hiring marginalized, or you want marginalized folks to come in and do training, you should be paying them for their expertise and work. And it should, in terms of like 2S LGBTQIA plus training, the facilitators should be, at least one of the facilitators always should be a queer or trans person.
Thank you, Christine.
Thank you, Christine. We received a question in French, so I'm gonna say it in French. I hope the interpretation button is on. Quelles sont les meilleures pratiques pour être des alliés dans le milieu de travail en lien avec votre présentation? Cette personne participante, elle aimerait en savoir plus sur les meilleures pratiques pour être des alliés dans les environnements de travail. Do you hear it in English, Christine? No. It's okay. I think I will say it in English.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. What are the best practices to become or to be an ally in workplace environment?
Yeah, so education, first and foremost. So not asking for your colleagues at work to provide that education to you, but looking for that education independently. And so there's lots of resources out there. Google could be your best friend sometimes. So making sure that you're educated, but also talking to the person that you're trying to be an ally to. So it's good to ask them, you know, I noticed that, you know, this person is referring to you as the wrong pronoun. Would you like me to correct that? Like, would you like me to talk to them and say, you know, they identify in this way. Can you please use this pronoun? Or just being the person that is open and friendly and not showing signs of fear, and being able to challenge in gentle ways harms that they see, because there is nothing worse than being the marginalized person in the room who then also has to speak up when harm is being caused. So being an ally is really, really important. But being an ally means doing a lot of listening and a lot of educating yourself around how to be an ally, because it's how a coworker might want to experience having an ally will be different for different people. And so just having that open communication is really important.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. I just have another questions very related to your answer from one of our participants. Do you have ideas of how education can be done to a workplace as a whole without the queer gender diverse staff being the one doing it? The emotional labor is not ours to do, and it's not our job to educate others.
Yeah, so hiring organizations that's what they do, right? Like I co-founded Workshop. We've been doing those trainings. We've only been around as an organization for about 3 years, but we've been doing those trainings for almost 15. And so those trainings are created by collectively by queer and trans people from various sectors, so including gender-based violence, disability, a bunch of other sectors. And so it costs money to bring training in, so it's paying for it, which I think is a part of accountability in terms of workplaces, right? So it also means not just sending staff into a training, but all levels of employees and managers and executive directors. And it often, depending on the space that you're in, it includes maintenance staff even, right? Just ensuring that everybody has the education, because what I often hear from workplaces is that you've come in and you've done this training for our staff 3 times now, but we can't get our management on board, or we can't get our board of directors on board. Well, that means that everybody needs training then, right? Like some of the organizations I work with, we train their board once a year, and then we train their management, and then we train their employees, so that we're ensuring that everyone is on the same page. I want to add another point because I just saw something in the chat about there being so much misinformation online, and that is an excellent point.
Yes.
And so one of the things I would say is look for trainings. So Rainbow Health Ontario sometimes does free online trainings. EGEL sometimes does free online trainings. My organization that I work with, Workshop, we sometimes do free online trainings. And so it could be reaching out to those organizations and asking, when is the next time you have a free training that's virtual, that's about whatever topic you're looking to learn more about, whether it's like a general training or specific to queer or trans identities.
Thank you, Kristen. I'll pass it to Jenna.
Thanks. I'm going to ask another semi-related question about how do you recommend that staff members bring up the desire to have 2SLGBTQIA plus training in the workplace? What if the workplace needs to be convinced that it's important, quote unquote?
Yes, that's a good question. I think this becomes the challenge because a lot of organizations don't necessarily think that they need training until they've had an issue where like a formal complaint has been made, and then they're having a reaction rather than actually, doing the preventative work. And so I think pitching the idea as it being preventative, like violence prevention work, is really important. And it depends on your organization or your sector that you're in. I think some sectors are more able to hear that we should have this training and why it's important. But I also think like just even talking about like how many people there are in Canada who identify this way, bringing up some information you learned today about what the research is saying, because I think generally speaking, most people aren't aware that 2SLGBTQIA plus people are experiencing such harm at work. And our workplaces often are doing trainings around, particularly around sexual violence, but that's a topic that has been around, and people working in this field have been pushing and pushing and pushing for this type of training for many years. And so we just need to start doing the same when it comes to LGBTQ populations as well as racialized populations, right?
Thank you, Christine. There's another question around the use of pronouns. One participant shared that recently they have come to understand that encouraging sharing pronouns should be only an invitation in the interest of trans, non-binary, and genderqueer people's choice and comfort to do so in each context. They are curious about your thoughts on that. And just to give you a little context, they facilitate workshop online.
So sorry, they're saying that
They came to understand that encouraging sharing pronoun should only be an invitation in the interest of trans, non-binary, and queer people's choice and comfort to do so in each context. And they are curious about your thought on that it should be only an invitation.
Right. And I think this is a very, very tricky topic, right? So, for me personally, for a while, I struggled with sharing pronouns because I worked in the gender-based violence sector for many years and was trying to sort of fit the feminine role. And so I almost had a panic attack every time I shared pronouns because I wasn't sure, like, should I say I identify as they, them? Should I say I identify as she, her, or maybe she's they? I was like really struggling with it. And so I understand that sort of fear that can come along with it. But also people can identify however they choose in that time, like in that space, right? And we really need to normalize the fact that people will use different pronouns in different spaces, depending on their level of safety. Um, and I don't know that so for most of the work that I have done, we've been like some people have their pronouns shared in their like name, some people don't. And I don't know that anyone's ever questioned it. Where I've seen pronouns or the use of pronouns in meetings be like beneficial are when people in the gender-based violence sector have been learning about them. And so they felt uncomfortable and sort of forced into identifying gender pronouns, even though they identify as the gender they were assigned at birth. And it was like for I'm thinking of one particular group, and for them, it was really uncomfortable at first. It wasn't forcing anyone to be out, and they didn't have to share. So I think it's important to say, you don't have to share. No one has to share if they're uncomfortable, but we also have to acknowledge that sometimes people who are cisgender will not share because they're not comfortable doing so. And so, there's positives and negatives to both.
Thank you, Christine. Merci.
Thank you. One audience member asked, do you have any advice for trans women facing trans misogyny in queer feminist spaces?
Ooh. Yeah. That's a really tough one because this is a huge problem. I'm sure this is why you're asking this question. I think it's finding your people, finding your allies and finding your people and surrounding yourself with people who are accepting and welcoming, despite the fact that there are a large portion of like feminist spaces that are not inclusive. I think that about every aspect of life. If you can find your people who have the same interests as you, especially in a movement like this, that can be a protective factor, but it doesn't change the fact that the movement has historically and in lots of cases, many people within it continue to not be very friendly.
Thank you.
There is another question here, Christine, about a student. As a social worker student who is planning to work in rural community where 2SLGBTQIA plus resources are limited, they were wondering how they can support 2SLGBTQIA plus populations in rural community.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it's in being an ally in so many ways. There's, in rural communities, people are at much higher risk of, you know, isolation and gender-based violence. Um, and as somebody who's a social worker, you can be that, maybe even that one person, right? Like there's been statistics that have said that, like, for trans youth, for example, having one supportive adult in their life can reduce their chances of suicidal ideation by 94%. So you could be that one person. And in terms of resources, I think it's like making sure that you have as much education as possible and that you seek out and are aware of whatever might be happening in that rural community, because there are pockets of queer and trans people everywhere, including in rural communities. And they're often doing they're doing work, but it just might not be that visible. Um, and so, yeah, I think trying to find it or assisting with finding other resources. So there are some like online groups where queer and trans people meet, or online parties that happen. So reaching out to resources if they don't have the ability to sort of leave their rural community, where they can still attend queer related events and get information.
Thank you. It's very helpful.
I'll go next. Another question from the audience. The laying of a complaint of harassment in the workplace often involves a supervisor undertaking an investigation. What are some considerations for prospective investigators to take into account when working with a complainant who has experienced one or more of these forms of workplace aggressions?
Right. So ideally they would have the education already. But if they don't, like in terms of like having a trauma-informed perspective, being able to recognize violence against queer or trans people as violence, even when they're microaggressions. And if they don't have that information, I think it's validation, right? It's providing validation and you know, committing to learning more. So if something happens and you don't, as a supervisor, you're like, I don't know, where does this fall? I've never experienced, you know, these types of complaints before. Then it's looking into it, right? Connecting with like online resources. It's maybe even contacting an organization that does queer and trans trainings that could even just like provide you with a little bit more information or some resources to read.
Thank you, Christine. And it's a question that is similar, but I think it's worth asking it. Do you have any strategies for managers who are trying to support employees who want to stay anonymous, while also, changing the workplace culture and hold people accountable for unacceptable behaviors? So it's like very connected to discussion, but with the specificity with the, being staying anonymous.
Right, yes. So I guess the approach in a situation like that could be, as a supervisor, pushing for further education in your workplace. Um, and you know, while continuing to support that person. We don't have to name people when we talk about what type of education needs to happen in our workplaces, right? We can promote the idea that this needs to happen. We can look for resources that we can put available around the workplace um, without naming people, right?
Yeah, thank you. I think I will let Jenna with the last question. Yeah.
One more question here. So why do you think intersectionality is often overlooked in discussions about workplace violence? And how can we shift this dynamic to better include the realities of individuals with multiple marginalized identities?
I think it's been overlooked because we sort of live in a like white settler heterosexual like cis sexist environment or society, right? And so there have been people for, you know, decades and decades now promoting the necessity of inclusion and of thinking more intersectionally, but we often still tend to silo, which I think is just because we live in this like white settler society that is very strong and deep rooted, and it makes it very challenging. And oftentimes, as I mentioned before, workplaces don't really engage in education until they're reacting to something. And so we need to move away from that and get to a point where we're thinking about intersectionality, we're thinking about violence, and we're providing the adequate education, because the people who are hearing complaints need to be able to understand intersectionality, to understand the type of violence and why it might be happening, not just in the workplace, but in in general, right? Like how we experience society. I as an example, I had a meeting with somebody last week who was in charge of a very a potential protest that was going to be quite harmful. And when I spoke with him about my concerns, his response to me was, well, I don't know what you're talking about. It's not my job to understand the current political climate. And I was like, whoa, as someone who's in charge of whether or not violence might happen here, it is your job to understand the current political climate and the ways that, you know, anti-immigration sentiment might come up, the ways that 2SLGBTQIA plus hate might come up. And so that's intersectionality. And so we really do need to really promote within our organizations the idea that we can't do any of this work without thinking more intersectionally.
Thank you so much, Christine. This is all the time we have for today. Thank you for your presentation, and also thank you for taking so much time to answer questions from the audience.
Thank you.
Thank you also to all of the interpreters today, Christy, Vanessa, Peter, and Cian. Thanks for joining, everyone.
Thank you, Christian.
Thank you.
Oh, we have one more thing to share before we head out from the Knowledge Hub. Sabri, would you like to share?
Yes, sure. So we just want to share that the registration is now open for the Knowledge Hub Present, Innovation in Addressing Gender-Based Violence and Trauma Violence Informed Health Promotion. And the conference will happen in October 1st, October 2nd in Toronto.